Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here for the next edition of our Great Reads Book Club. And I am very, very excited about our discussion today because we have three legends in the field to engage in a rich conversation about topics of great import and interest to all of us in the field. So with that, let me please hand it over to our capable host for today, Michelle.
Thanks so much, Colin, and welcome to everyone. Really, really delighted to be here with all of you from no doubt many parts of the US and perhaps even further afield. I am thrilled to be today in conversation with my dear friends and colleagues, Jackie Font-Guzman and also Bernie Mayer. I'm sure that they know that they need no introduction whatsoever to any of you, but let me just remind all of us that Jackie Font-Guzman is the inaugural Executive Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Eastern Mennonite University and a professor at the Center for Justice and Peacebuilding at EMU. And Bernie tells us that he is a citizen of the world. I can confirm this, having encountered him in various parts of the world, and Professor Emeritus of Conflict Studies at Creighton University, founding partner at CDR, and so much more is true about both of them. One of the questions I've been working with lately is, what can we see from here? What is possible to perceive from this particular moment in time, moment in history, moment in political evolution or devolution, whichever moment we are in. And this is a question that's really been animating my thinking. For those of you who don't know, I'm Michelle LeBaron and I'm a professor of law at the University of British Columbia, Vancouver, Canada, previously at the School for Conflict Analysis and Resolution at George Mason. And this question, what can I see from over here in what we in Canada would call the Southwest and what you might call the Northwest? What can we see given the way that media is telling stories to us and obscuring other stories? And that question came so clearly to mind for me as I was reading Jackie and Bernie's new book, which I think is a very, very important book in the field because it is asking us to think about something that has been an assumption for too long. This whole question about neutrality. You know, we are so affixed in our identities to neutrality that we often use it as a noun, right? We call ourselves a neutral. And what Jackie and Bernie have given us in a very dialogic and vulnerable way, vulnerable in the best sense of that term, because willing to be courageous, willing to engage the hard questions, is another perspective, a perspective about how, if we are committed to social change and to engagement with the very difficult exclusions that are perpetuated in our world and in our field, whether racial or to do with gender or sexual orientation or social and economic class or many other intersections of exclusions, then we have to really question ourselves concerning this assumption about neutrality. And so I have prepared a few questions for Jackie and Bernie. They will answer in the flow of their conversation, as they actually do in the book. So it's a lovely kind of parallel. And we will leave time toward the end for engagement with all of you. Not enough, I can tell you right now, because in fact, we will wish we had another hour or two, I'm sure, because these ideas are not easy and they're not glib. These ideas are actually substantial. And if we were to implement what Jackie and Bernie are advocating in the book, our field would have a different look. And I would suggest that our field would have more impact. and actually be more socially relevant. So I will begin by just talking about the kind of overarching theme, if I might, of the book, and then talk about some specific questions that for me arose as I read it. First of all, you talk about the neutrality trap, Jackie and Bernie, and you're really questioning one of the foundations of the practice of mediation in so many people's minds. And if we were to survey all of the current mediation training programs, we would see a lot of discussion, I think, about neutrality. So can you just share with us, first of all, how it is that your conviction about the importance of doing that has overridden your fear of backlash, and what it is about the neutrality trap that you felt is so relevant right now? And Jackie or Bernie, either of you could start.
Well, maybe I'll start on this because I've written about it for a long time.
Yeah.
I think it's a false promise to people, and I felt that for quite a while, that we were neutral. For one thing, no one quite knows what that word means. It has so many different connotations. It translates in languages in different ways, and I'm not sure it's really what people want from us. I think a challenge for us is to try to describe what we offer without using impartial or neutral or even unbiased. I think what we offer to people is we really are committed, if we're functioning as mediators, to helping them to have the conversation they need to have in a constructive way. But what we bring to the table that helps that is partly the values we have that do not make us neutral, like a belief in empowerment, a belief that everybody has a right to an equal voice or a significant voice at a table, which means we often have to act in a way that isn't neutral when there are power differentials. Because I think in the most serious conflicts that we face, there almost always are power differentials of one kind or another. And if we just take whatever I think a lot of people feel term neutral implies, and so to actually fulfill the values we have, I think we have to do the opposite of that. Now, we could put that into all sorts of specific contexts, but I will say it really was driven home for me and Jackie in the period after George Floyd's murder, when a lot of people were just saying, well, let's just bring people together to talk, rather than realize really what needed to happen was building a movement, and talking had been part of that, but a lot more that had to happen. And if all we think about this lens of neutrality, then we don't really see what's going on.
So what you talk about as strategic disruption, I think, is what was called for in the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. Jackie, anything to add?
Yes, for me, having lived kind of different experiences, coming from Puerto Rico originally, and actually taking my first trainings and introduction to ADR and conflict world from a different cultural perspective, I always had a real challenge with this aspect of neutrality. In partly because where I was coming from and the work I had been doing in the Caribbean and Latin America, this whole concept of neutrality took a different kind of like twist. And for example, I was never calling to mediations because I was neutral. For the most part, I was calling to mediations because someone knew me or someone knew my mother or someone knew. And so there was nothing neutral about that. And I knew parties and I knew their background and their context and who they were, and coming from an island, we're kind of all in the same, kind of like spaces. So I always had the very first trainings I was going through, it was like, this doesn't there's a disconnect here between what I am experiencing in my life as a mediator here in Puerto Rico and what I am being told in the way I should act when I'm actually engaging with mediations. And I really could see that come through when I started expanding and doing mediations in Florida and for other companies, major companies in the US. And they were calling me in for a completely different reason. They were calling me in because they thought I was neutral because I wasn't from there. And therefore, when they had high sensitive or complicated cases, or cases that were delicate because there was some sort of circumstance that they felt they needed someone neutral, then they were reaching out to me. And that always was surprising because I knew I had a lot of colleagues, especially in Florida of all states, that did know, a lot about mediation, and they were just as good or better than me. So I've always been struggling with that. And I've also thought that we're not really neutral, and I don't think we really should be. If by neutrality we mean that we want to hold those values that we actually hold dear. And Bernie started mentioning some of them, right? People's degree of self-determination, the value of having a voice, the value of being able to really share your stories in ways that you cannot share them in the legal context, for example. And so for me, that was a contradiction in itself, that if I was going to hold back because I felt I needed to be neutral, and that somehow that was going to influence negatively the process, even by holding back, I was already not being neutral anyway. And so I never those who know me know I don't usually make decisions based on backlash. I just for good or worse, I just go all in and dive into things. But I thought it was an important conversation to be raised again. Especially, my view has always been that mediation can actually do a lot more than just solve someone's conflict, that we are within a larger context of oppression, that we are under a larger context of misogyny, patriarchy, and so many other things that are surrounding us that are oppressive, that it's delusional to think that when we're solving someone's problem, all of those things need to be put on a bubble, isolated. And so I didn't think that we could be neutral as we were doing those type of things, and if we were moving the profession or the discipline forward to actually impact change.
Thank you both. That's those are some very rich comments to get us started. I'm circling back, Bernie, to something you said. You're not sure that we ever really knew what neutrality was in the first place, and thinking about talking about impartiality or equidistance, and we've kind of reached, haven't we, for different spatial ways of thinking about how to situate ourselves. And you're providing us, the two of you, with a very different way of thinking about how we situate ourselves, a way which is perhaps more transparent in terms of who we are, who as humans with values and particular identities we are as we step into the midst of others' troubles. Another question that I had relates to others' troubles, and particularly perhaps all of our troubles these days, as we're in the midst of contestation around rights to end pregnancies. And so that's my next question. In your book, you talk about the hope and challenge of enduring conflict, and you use conflict over abortion as an example of how any intractable conflict has many dimensions. Given that we can't resolve that conflict ever, but hopefully can manage it in effective ways, what do we need to know about how to manage an enduring conflict, like conflict over legal rights to abortion, and what might strategic disruption that you talk about look like in relation to this issue?
Well, in a way, those are two opposite questions, because what I think is most of our most important conflicts are enduring and will not end. That doesn't mean there's no element of them that can end. You know, you could perhaps imagine a time where we had settled some of the issues, like which I worked on at one point, mediating outside, picketing outside abortion clinics. And you know, the other thing I think we always have to think about is, well, can we keep any kinds of constructive lines of communication open? And that has actually become harder in some ways, because it's not only that we become more polarized, but we tend to live in more and more bubbles that don't interact, that don't have natural ways of connecting. And I think a big issue is, how do you keep people talking or connecting or understanding that each other are real people, even if we have profound differences, that they're still rich, rounded human beings? And how can we kind of keep that happening? And I think one of the things we talk about in the book, but one of the most important tools as well, is to look at how we can help people share their stories with each other in a richer way. Whether that, and then the question about disruption is a little different, although it's related, because in order to change some of we're going to be seeing, I think, in the United States anyhow, some really regressive things happening. We already are, about abortion, and it's very scary. And what it's going to take over time is building a movement, and that is going to counteract some of that stuff. It's not simply going to be about talking or reaching out or connecting. That's why the subtitle of our book says Disrupting and Connecting. So the question is, what can those movements do to disrupt the systems that are continuing to make it harder and more dangerous for women to make the choices to end their pregnancy? And first of all, let me say, I think that's a critical question. But secondly, let me also say, one of the most disruptive things we can do is to break people's stereotypes about why people do it. And that, in a way, is also about people coming out, people telling stories, people making it much more real what their experiences are about. And there are a lot of other ways in which that can happen as well. But the question is less just about connecting alone, and more about how do you disrupt people's ways of thinking? How do you challenge the systems that are perpetuating that? How do you perhaps begin to challenge the political dynamics that make it in everybody's interest to promote restrictions on abortion?
Thanks, Bernie. And Jackie, I think you have something to add.
I do. I would add, I mean, I fully agree with Bernie on that. And I would add, I think some of the challenges that we also try to talk about in the book is that when we talk about social change, we associate it with this big, gigantic system out there that is out there, somewhere out there, right? Let's go and stand in front of a abortion clinic and or Congress, and let's go on and protest, and let's do escalation. And we think about civil rights movement and Martin Luther King. And I think we forget that, and we hope, I mean, we provide some examples of that in the book, that the institutions where we're working and the places where we share day to day are also places to make social change. And that if we can start using some of the skill sets that have been historically used for civic organizing and organizing movements, and bring those into institutions, you know, our academic institutions, our healthcare institutions, our educational institutions. If you're a teacher, when you walk into the classroom, that is a way of affecting and impacting the larger, broader social change. And so I think we sometimes live in this fragmented world where we think, you know, I come in and I do, and actually that is something, it was a cultural change when I moved to the US also, because there's this fragmented worlds where there's the people you work with, there's the people you engage in community with, there's the people that are your family, there's your group of friends at work, and then there's your group of work somewhere else. And all of these places, all of these people and all of these groups rarely connect with each other. And we forget that in our day-to-day, a way of actually affecting social change and issues like abortion is about sharing some of these stories within all these different groups, and even have events where we can bring all these people together. And it doesn't have to even be to talk about that. It's about connecting with each other. And I always found it interesting. And Boston, after studying here, Boston, Massachusetts was the first place I actually had like my first real job, right? The first real job you get after you graduate I graduated from my master's degree in healthcare and went to work at Boston. And I was in shock by just experiencing, wow, the people at work really never get to know the people at their families or their, it was this very fragmentation. And I think that hurts us. And I think that may vary in different contexts and different cities and different states. But I think overall we're not intentional about making those connections. And I actually really wholeheartedly believe that that is a way of affecting social change. And that wherever we are in our positions of institutions or power mediations that we're doing, that planting those seeds are really important to make the change we actually want to see in our world. And we don't do enough of that because we live these fragmented lives.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm just really aware that there are many very experienced people on this call. And so I feel the weight of responsibility of asking questions that will get to the heart of your work and of the issues that are confronting us, because I can feel many questions amongst us. But I want to pick up, Jackie, on what you just talked about. You used the word fragmented several times. And I think it would be something that most or all of us would agree on, that we live in fragmented times. We live in a time of fragmentation. Institutions are fragmenting, and systems that were once a kind of given are falling apart in some ways, or not functioning in the way that they might have functioned for a long time. There's been a lot of disruption in the system, and there's ongoing disruption, whether we're thinking globally or more locally. And that brings to mind for me the words of the great Swiss psychologist Carl Jung, who said that in the coming times, as he was projecting forward into our times, it's really important for the center to hold. And I wonder, what is the role of dispute resolvers and mediators in holding the center? And how does that relate to what you're writing about in the book, this neutrality trap? So we hold the center in terms of our presence, the presence we bring to the work that we do, but also in terms of being aware of this wider social context that you're both talking about. So Jackie, if we could start with you, I think you have some thoughts about this, this thought of Carl Jung's.
Yes, I do. And I think, I'm actually a big fan of him, but I also on his work in terms of his perspectives of how he looks into psychology and the contributions he made. But I also think one of the premises that we haven't been tackling or challenging much is to understand that the center as originally conceived is a center to hold the status quo, and that not everyone has been part of that center. I haven't been part of that center as a Latina woman from Puerto Rico when I come to the US. I haven't been part of that center when I'm in Puerto Rico as a woman, depending on what the center is holding, right? So I think one of the things we should start challenging as conflict interveners and mediators is, when we're talking about the center, we need to recognize that the center wasn't built or created for all of us to be included in it. And that it does what it does many times is support the status quo that is oppressive. That when we talk about let's come to the center, somehow we're thinking about stability, we're thinking about a togetherness, kind of like a circle, right? We're like in it together. But we need to challenge the premise, like, is that circle welcoming to everyone, and has it been intended to actually hold everyone in the same way? And so that would be my first comment. And I think maybe shifting our thinking about even disrupting the center itself, and what are some new centers that need to be created, and how do those new centers then start intersecting with each other, is what I envision as something that could really move us towards change and disrupting the structures that are not working clearly from everyone. As you very well said, Michelle, we're suffering a fragmentation of our processes and structures. And part of it is because they're not working. And so I think challenging even our premises as to what all these terms have meant historically and traditionally for us are an important step.
Thank you so much. We were having a conversation about this the other day, and your thoughts about this particular point have really been sitting with me. So I'm happy to hear you elaborate about that. Bernie, anything you wanted to add?
Well, I would like to maybe make, it's one addition. It's a big issue. And I think the way you hold the center isn't superficially. It isn't by reaching superficial papering over agreements, which, you know, there's a role for those. I mean, there's a role for agreements that are just on the immediate issue. But for example, if you really have a really profound problem in a workplace with the conflicts between different parts of the workplace, maybe different ethnic groups or between labor and management, and you're just working on resolving all the grievances, but not what's underlying the issue, you're not holding the center. You may be doing something valuable, but you're not helping deal with the center. And I think one of the things that we talk about and we've tried to deal with is what it takes to at least acknowledge and own the fact that there are some fundamental issues which are enduring, which require us to keep talking about them, which require some really difficult and unpleasant conversations that there's no really easy answer to, because the way to create a center is not to ignore the systemic or the structural, the deeply rooted issues that are dividing us. It's going through, frankly, a very painful route.
Yeah, and I would add, Bernie, that I think, you know, what would it look like if we actually acknowledge that there are many centers and not only one, and that there's intersectionality in those centers, because I think that's part of the trap we fall into many times, unintentionally. I mean, by really trying to have this conceptualization of bringing people together, but I just don't think there's one center. I don't think there's never been only one center, and I don't think that that's not certainly where we're headed.
Thank you. Lots and lots of provocative, thoughtful comments, and I appreciate them. Also, from the conversation we had the other day, Bernie, I wrote something down that's been sitting with me, and it's not a direct quote, but it's a paraphrase. I think you said that if you think that your role as a conflict intervener is bringing peace into the room, you might be preventing change from happening. And I wondered if one or both of you might comment on that, because again, you know, in our field, we've had a lot of conversation about what is the state that I bring into the room? Can I bring a state of equanimity, for example, into the room, and that might help de-escalate things which have become amplified? And so it's a provocative statement that you made, and I thought maybe you'd follow it up here.
It's not like I'm against equanimity or bringing a peaceful or a calm or kind or welcoming state into a room. God knows I don't always succeed in that, but I think that's not a bad thing. But that in itself is just part of the picture. And if it's all, let's all, I've said for many years, the theme song of our field ought not to be, come on people now, smile on your brother, everybody get together, got to love one another right now. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but we have to help people say painful things, and things that often are emotional and angry and upset. And we have to help them do that. And we have to recognize some of the real issues of power and depression and discrimination that we may be facing. And to do that, we have to sometimes speak the uncomfortable. And we have to be able to speak the uncomfortable directly and with power and with respect. And I think sometimes we just feel that our job is to help people get along. We could talk about some of the responses, for example, to what's happening in the Ukraine, which is, why can't we just have peace? Well, there's oppression going on. There's vast power differences going along. Just asking, bringing our equanimity to the situation isn't going to help very much.
Yeah, and also,
Let's bring our anger, frankly, at some point.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think also that harmony at the expense of the humanity of those people that are on the receiving end of what it means to sustain that harmony. For example, we've done a lot of damage and harm to LGBTQ community members. We've done a lot of harm to African Americans, to Latinx, to refugees, because in the whole concept and idea of preserving harmony, we're really doing it at the expense and the cost of those individuals enduring a type of violence that is not acceptable. And so harmony for whom? Like, who is that harmony benefiting would be a good question to ask. And at what cost and what expense are we actually encouraging or trying to sustain or keep that harmony or peace? And I'm not sure those are questions that we always ask, or give it the intentionality and the time that it merits, because we want everything to be okay and have peace. But peace for just a few doesn't really work that well in a society. Long term, for sure, it will not work.
So I think what I'm hearing is that the way that we prepare ourselves to be conflict interveners, the things that we do when we get in the room, or on our way to the room, or on our way out of the room, need to change. And that our discomfort with emotion, for example, which I think is very pervasive in the field. We have all these ideas about kind of letting people vent and getting rid of the pesky emotions so we can be rational. And we have these ideas about how emotional expression is a bad thing. Heaven forbid you should say the word anger, Bernie. And in fact, we're talking about cultivating then within ourselves a comfort with strong emotions. I've always thought it's very strange in family mediation, the term high conflict couples, as if those people who are more emotional are really problematic and we need a special label for them. What if we were conflict fluent in a way that was a little bit less repressed, perhaps, and that was part of our preparation. And that leads me to ask the question, if you could do two things, because we have to be mindful of time, maybe one thing each, Jackie and Bernie, what would you do in terms of changing the way training and education happens in the field? I know you would do 100 things, but pick one, please.
You go first, Jackie. I have to think.
Well, I have to think also, but I will think as I talk and see how that goes. There's a lot of things we do. I do want to start by prefacing, there's a lot of things we do well, right? I mean, we have really a good group of colleagues and professionals in this field that do a lot of things well. So I don't want it to sound like we're in a total chaos and disaster and we have to change everything, right? But if there's one thing that I think I would change is to really start looking at how preparing ourselves in a way that we don't see individual interventions as only addressing individual needs, that we look at and we start looking at how those individual needs are nested within larger social conflicts and identities. And that if we start looking at that way if we start looking at that way in how we intervene with mediations, I think then we can see ourselves as, like I like to say, planting seeds or giving people tools to go above and beyond of just solving or addressing their individual needs. That I would like us to be less neutral and start moving towards using those spaces of mediation to empower people to really be agents of change above and beyond their individual needs, and maybe start moving towards more communal ways of thinking. Because I don't see how, for example, you were talking about family mediation, Michelle, and I don't see how we can honestly and authentically sit down and do any kind of family mediation without really being aware that patriarchy is a thing in our society. And so is misogynism. And so if we narrow the conflict so much, those kind of things like just are drop off of our engagement with people. And so it's a way of connecting with people, even if they have those differences. So that would be one thing I would love to see us do more. And so how can we start shifting our trainings so that we still continue to address people's needs, but have them learn even a little bit more about how they can actually affect change.
Thank you.
Well, Michelle, I was translated your question to a slightly different question, which is, what do I wish I had most, or what did I have to learn how to, really do? And it really was to get comfortable with conflict and confront my own conflict avoidant tendencies. I remember telling a long-term friend of mine once that I thought I was a conflict avoider, and he said to me, well, you may be a conflict avoider, but you're terrible at it. And so I thought, well, maybe that's a good thing. What is it that I avoid? Why? What am I afraid of? And why do I sometimes have to go like this in conflict with relationships and in mediation? I think that I have seldom made a mistake that was about delving deeper into people's feelings, and I have often made the mistake of trying to go like this. So I would have said that my training needed to involve much more for me of doing that kind of work earlier on. And so I guess that's what I would say I think needs to be more in training.
Thank you so much. If I can beg the indulgence of the group, I'll ask you one more question and then we'll open it up. And there are so many that I think are wanting to be asked, but the one that I feel is most pressing at this moment, it comes back a bit to what we were talking about related to fragmentation, but it's also about social brittleness. And, your brittleness, things are brittle, they're easily broken, they're quite, the ice is thin, I think, that we walk on, to use a northern metaphor from Canada for a moment. And your book squarely says, we take a perspective, it is a perspective about equity and about fairness and about inclusion. And I think I'll speak for everyone on this call presumptively and say we're aligned. And how is it then that bridges are built with those who are thinking differently? Because again, I think some of the brittleness arises from lack of bridges. So you say in the book, we need to hold a kind of ambiguity, a kind of spaciousness, and yet at the same time, we have our own values, our own ideas of how as a society, as things are falling apart, we need to create multiple new centers, as you've said, Jackie. So how do we do that in ways that actually build strong connection with the other? And I'm speaking politically here. So the other politically, the person who's on the other side of the spectrum from where we may feel we are.
Well, maybe I'll just say this. I don't want to say too much. I think it is not about avoiding difficult issues. I hate the expression, you should never talk about religion or politics or whatever a third might be, because I think really what deepens connections is when we can talk about our differences, when I can share. I remember one time when for example, being able to have a really meaningful conversation with somebody who I like quite a bit, who was a creationist. And I was able to talk about evolution and why I didn't believe in that. And we got our way through it. Similar about issues of race or about gender issues. When we can talk about our most difficult things, where we hold our own values and beliefs, but that doesn't stop us from connecting with someone else. That's when we deepen things across our differences, not when we just promote. It's hard, but it's not when we just promote shallow interactions.
Yeah, and I would add to that, and I would always ask the question, like, what is the purpose for us to meet with someone who thinks different than us? Like, why would want to do that? And it's not to convince them necessarily to think differently or to get them to come on our side of things. I think it's about just really authentically having a conversation. And in many places and communities and countries, and certainly where I live and my experiences have been, that when you talk about relationship, people tend to think about, oh, a relationship, right? Like being good friends or just having someone that's there for you, and somehow relationship, like that's where we usually go. And I think looking at relationship in like a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being your closest friend, the person you go and share your, excitements and concerns, and 1 being maybe just a casual encounter at a supermarket of someone you will never ever see again, never, just the less you have a relationship for a second when you say, yeah, go ahead of me or whatever, that we don't, to start moving towards effecting some change, we don't even need to aim for a 10. That if you can just be intentional about even doing a 2 or a 3, right, which is, yes, engaging a little bit more than just a casual encounter, but a lot less than your, lifetime relationship best friend, that is, if you go into thinking we're going to connect with someone else without that pressure, that helps a lot. And it also is the intentionality of reaching out, authentically reaching out to listen to people. I actually literally put it on my calendar at work, right? So as I'm doing DEI, there's some people are really for, some initiatives, some people are really against it, and some people are kind of in the middle of the road. I just send emails and set up coffee appointments just to have a conversation. And sometimes it's not even about the policy we want to change, but I'm just really trying to make some sort of connection, because what that does is it won't change them. Like I haven't, it's not like I sit down with you and have coffee and after a 1-hour conversation or 30 minutes, you have completely bought into my idea. But I'll tell you what it does do. When the policy or the issue is being discussed, there is a willingness and openness to at least allow you to share the information. And that is better than having people shutting down completely. So my level of intentionality goes to the extent of actually trying to book on my calendar every week to reach out to someone that I know opposes or is on the fence. This isn't the example in case of my work. But finding techniques and things to force you to do that, because it doesn't come natural, right? You want to be with the people that think like you. You want to be with the folks that are going to say, yeah, you rock. Yes, go for it. So it does require some intentionality. I mean, even for me, who I've written a lot about this and I strongly believe in it, no, I don't just wake up one day and, I have to be intentional about it. Because if I want to call someone, the first person I'm going to think about is not going to be the person that thinks completely opposite to me. So I think those are ways. And I think it's important to engage in those connections.
Absolutely. I really agree. I'm just thinking back to a workplace that I've been involved in where half of the faculty are not speaking to the other half, and all over issues related to someone's tweet about BDS, boycott, divestments, and sanctions in relation to Palestine, Israel. So, these things are not just out there. They are where we live. They are where we work. And I really appreciate that point that you've both made as well. And the many other nuggets you've shared with us. Time now for us to go to the chat or to questions that people may wish to pose with their voices as opposed to the chat. I notice in the chat that we have a question from Sherry, who asks about whether the transformative approach to mediation is able to do more around exploring emotions than other forms of mediation. So Bernie or Jackie, I wonder if you might start by just addressing that, and then we'll just open the floor. So if you want to use the raise hand function, you can do that. That's down under reactions at the bottom of your screen, as no doubt everyone knows now. We're pretty Zoom familiar. But Bernie or Jackie, transformative mediation.
Well, I think some of the issues transformative people have raised about rush to solutions are very relevant and important. You know, I think sometimes they think they're the only approach that really has done that, and that they are the only, and that their way opens it. But I think their approach, the question that any approach raises is, you don't transform things by intentionally trying to transform. You transform by engaging and trying to be real and authentic and deal with what's really going on, and not rush to an agenda. And then some magical things happen sometimes, and sometimes they don't.
Thank you. Milan, you have a question. Please unmute.
Thank you. This is the theme which is running through my head probably from the day I started mediating. And there are a lot of things, and I'm hoping I will be able to put some of these ideas together with the questions which I have. So I was thinking how to resolve this issue of the neutrality and malicious partiality, and condense both these into one sentence. And I came with the sentence, I do not favor anyone, as which would portray neutrality, versus I favor everyone equally, as some form of multi-partiality. And then I was thinking about the situation about the neutrality trap in conjunction with the terms favoring and equality. So I'm sitting hypothetically in a mediation, and suddenly one of the parties accuses me and says, well, you are not neutral at all, and you are not for sure impartial. You are favoring the other side. And if I answered, well, I'm sorry, but the concept of neutrality is to some extent a fiction. It is a trap. I don't know if I would make these people happy. So I would have to really say, in which sense, how they define for themselves the concept of neutrality, and how would I, dialogically dispel this problem for them when I'm, will address my conceptual understanding of it. Now, that would be the first thing, setting up the stage. The second one be, of course, I would have to ask myself a question, really? Am I not favoring somebody? Or am I really, treating these people equally? So that's the question for myself as I'm going along. So I want to really tie it to my fairly recent experience. I got a response to the article which I wrote when I was essentially accused that I am biased. And the article was about essentially conversation between vaccinated and unvaccinated people. And so I got a couple of responses, and I was literally by two people, they accused me, I'm sorry, you are biased. And so my answer to them was, well, my understanding of bias is that it is actually fairly subconscious, and I should not be aware, if I'm, leaning one way or another, but I am not hiding anything. I'm not pretending anything. I'm very clearly explaining where I'm coming from. So the first question would be, if I'm aware of my position and if I'm presenting myself from certain place, is it a bias or it is not? So that's the first part for both of you.
Okay, let's pause there and ask Bernie or Jackie to give some thoughts, and then we'll hear Lorraine's question and see if there are any others, so that we can make as much time as possible for everyone who has questions. Go ahead.
You looking at me, Jackie, or am I?
I don't
looking at-
know. So it seemed like you had something to say at one point when he was asking the question. Do you want to go first, or?
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I'll go first. Okay, so I mean, there's a lot in the question, but first of all, I do think that there are times where you absolutely, as a mediator, you're going to say the answer is going to be yes, I'm not going to be neutral, and yes, I'm not going to favor everyone equally. Because if there are issues of racism or clearly anti-LGBTQ or clearly something that's putting someone in harm's way, that there is no space for being neutral or being even apologetic in terms of saying no. This is where I stand and this is what I believe. There's a larger issue here about, our shared humanity. So I do not believe that we are even in a position to authentically always even make the promise that we're even going to even aspire to treat everyone equally. I don't think we should treat everyone equally in a mediation process ever, actually, because precisely there are imbalances of power. And if you treat everyone equally, then you're actually going to be harming someone, most likely. Someone's going to get the short end of the process here. In terms of bias, not all biases are implicit, right? There's implicit and then there's explicit bias. And I think when you're looking at the incident of Central Park, I'm blanking on the name of this woman now who called 911 because there was a black man bird watching, walking a dog. He was bird watching and she was a white woman not following an ordinance that required her to have her dog on a leash if she was actually walking her dog in the park. And when he dared to ask her politely to put the dog on a leash, she immediately called 911. And she said, if I call now and I say a black man is threatening me, the police is going to come. And she did exactly that. And she knew exactly what she was doing. And there is nothing implicit about that. So I do think we need to also be able to call out, when we're talking about bias, there's explicit bias that needs to be called out and named. And then, yes, there are implicit biases that we all have that are at some of an unconscious level. And those are two very different things and should be treated differently. Nevertheless, both of them need to be either called in or called out, depending on the circumstance. But none of them should, in none of those incidents, even if whether it be implicit or explicit, I think should a mediator remain neutral. I think there's a moral duty and an obligation to actually address those biases, whether they're implicit or explicit, and ways to work with those biases to acknowledge them and recognize them. And I think that's a very important first step. And even not only your own biases as a mediator, but any biases, whether implicit or explicit, that you're seeing in the parties as you're sitting there with them, having them and facilitating a constructive conversation. So those were some of the few things I wrote down, Milan, when you were talking. But Bernie, I think you have something else to add.
Well, I know you really covered most. Let me simply say that I don't think it ever works to say, no, really, I am unbiased, or I am treating everybody equal, or I am neutral. I think those are always ineffective. I think what is more effective is the three words I say I've said when I'm training media is, when you don't know what else to say, try these. They'll usually work, not always, and that is tell me more. I think if you really get into it a little bit more, well, all right, I want to hear more about that, you probably will open up something that you can talk about. But since I don't think neutrality, or in that sense of the word equality, or impartiality, or being unbiased really it works or has a lot of meaning, I'm certainly not going to try to defend myself in those terms.
Yeah, thank you both. I think you gave us some very responsive comments to what I heard as two aspects of, Milan, what you were asking. One about the parties in a mediation who accuse you of not being neutral, and then the comments about bias in your post. So we're going to move on to Lorraine at this point. Lorraine, your question.
Yes, well, it's more in the nature of comments. First, I wanted to say thank you so much for writing this book. I think it's really important and really needed. And I personally find it very validating because I never, ever, even when I was starting out, felt comfortable calling myself neutral. And what I started doing is saying, I'm not neutral. I'm passionately committed to helping the two of you communicate better. And that seemed to work well for me. And one of the reasons I switched from doing mediation to more doing conflict coaching is because what I've found is when I can work with people individually, really validate their experience and also start opening, so they feel supported, and then start opening up the questions of, well, how might they see it? And what other narratives are possible here? Then when they come together, their hearts tend to be more open, and it works really well. And I've worked with a number of LGBTQ and people of color and neurodiversity people. And I always internally ask the question, is this part of where the misunderstandings are coming from? Sometimes it's communication issues, sometimes it is assumptions and implicit bias. And opening up in that way to have, it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can look at the role that all of those play. Sometimes miracles happen. And it's wonderful when we're able to do that. Thank you.
Lorraine, lovely comments. Thank you so much. And a real affirmation of the usefulness and the inspiration from Jackie and Bernie's work. We have time to squeeze in one more question. Anyone with one more question or comment or wondering? Going once. Twice. Well, then I think Bernie and Jackie, maybe we'll give you the last word. What would you say to sum up or reflect on this conversation we've had today, and on you having written such a timely book? I think for the moment that we're in, for what we can see from here, this book is a very important part of the conversation. Last words, Bernie, then Jackie.
Well, it feels like every time we talk about it, I feel like two things. One, we're still just scratching the surface in some way. And the other is, what is the practical implications about what all this means for what to do? And we have tried to include a lot of that in the book, but I will put in a little advertisement. Jackie and I, with our colleague Susan Terry, wrote a letter to colleagues about the Ukraine and about how our people from our field or the peacemaking conflict field might respond, and some principles to follow and some actions to take. And guess where it's publicized in this week's newsletter from Mediate.com. And I think maybe that takes the discussion down to, all right, can you help us understand what this means for what we actually do a little bit more? Because I think that's a legitimate question.
Mm-hmm.
And thank you all very much. I really appreciate it. And Michelle, thank you for really stimulating questions.
My pleasure. And Jackie, last word to you.
Yeah, and I think our hope with the book is also to start having people think more deeply about those things and things about the applications to it, and how can we grow more in what we do and have more of an impact in our society, especially since one of the things that triggered both of us to start working on this was when the Floyd murder happened and everything that was happening and happened afterwards. So I hope it serves as a catalyst of all of you having more conversations about all of this. And I'll also pull a plug in for Bernie and I will be teaching a class June 6th through June 10th. It will be an intensive 5-day course at the Center for Justice and Peace Building here at EMU, which is in Harrisonburg, Virginia. And it's I think it's the first time we will be using, it will be the first time we'll be using the book to teach and to start really finding applications and exploring with the students and the people who register more applications about how this can be used in ways that advance our society. That was the place we wanted to see. And thank you everyone for spending this hour And Michelle and Colin, thanks so much for facilitating and creating this space. I really appreciate it.
And thank you all for attending. And I see some old friends' names on here. I wish I could be talking to you directly. But anyhow, it's nice to talk to all of you like this.
Thank you both so much. And Colin, for hosting and giving us all this opportunity to come together about these really important ideas. I leave feeling heartened, and I think we need to feel heartened in this day, even as we look directly at the very substantial challenges in our midst. So thanks, everyone. Thanks, Colin.